Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us for the fourth lecture in our Muharram series. My name is Samia Kaku, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Organization for Islamic Learning. The organization, or OIL, is a charitable, non-profit, community-based group that strives to build a membership whose main goal is to understand and practice the essence of Islam in an inclusive environment. We promote learning activities based on the teachings of the Quran and the values of its Prophet and his family. OIL is a registered charity, and as such, we depend on your donations to continue our programs. Every little helps, and we can provide donation receipts for any amount above $25. We are accepting donations via our website, islamiclearning.org. We will be having a Q&A session after the lecture. Questions can be submitted through Menti. The code is 25365869. Note that this code is valid from now until the end of the lecture series, even when we are not live. We would like to start the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Kumail and Daniel Sayed, followed by a Noha by Nazneen Muhammad Taki.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإن من أهل الكتاب لمن يؤمن بالله وما أنزل إليكم وما أنزل إليهم خاشعين لله لا يشترون بآيات الله ثمنا قليلا أولئك لهم أجرهم عند ربهم إن الله سريع الحساب.
Most surely of the followers of the book, there are those who believe in Allah and that which has been revealed to you and that which has been revealed to them. Being lowly before Allah, they do not take a small price for communications of Allah. These it is that have the reward with their Lord. Surely Allah is quick in reckoning. Sadaqallahu al-Aliyyul Azim.
बर शहनशाह कायनात इमामे ज़माना बावाज़ बुलंद सलवात अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मदिन व आलि मुहम्मद व अज्जिल फरजहुम। अकबर तुम्हें मालूम है क्या मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिज़ा मांग रहे हो। अकबर तुम्हें मालूम है क्या मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिज़ा मांग रहे हो। इस आलम गुर्बत में तुम्हें जाने दो कैसे, इस दश्त मुसीबत में तुम्हें जाने दो कैसे, इस वक्त कयामत में तुम्हें जाने दो कैसे। हे लाल जो तुम इज़्ने विगा मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिज़ा मांग रहे हो। अकबर तुम्हें मालूम है क्या मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिज़ा मांग रहे हो। क्या गुजरेगी इस बाप के दिल पर नहीं सोचा, तुमने ये मेरी जाली अकबर नहीं सोचा। मर जाऊंगा मैं तुझसे बिछड़ कर नहीं सोचा, तुम मुझसे ज़ईफ़ी का असा मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिज़ा मांग रहे हो। अकबर तुम्हें मालूम है क्या मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिजा मांग रहे हो। दिल रोता है नजरों से अगर दूर हो बैठा, जिस तरह जुदाई तेरी मंजूर हो बेटा। तुम ही मेरी आंखें हो, मेरा नूर हो बेटा, मुझसे मेरी आंखों की जिया मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिजा मांग रहे हो। दुनिया सा गए जिस करी महबूब खुदा का, नाना की जियारत को तड़पता था नवासा। ए लाल तुझे इसलिए खालिक से था मांगा, मकबूल हुई मेरी दुआ मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिजा मांग रहे हो। रखते नहीं तुम्हें इसकी खबरें मेरे प्यारे, इस दर्जा मुहब्बत है तेरे दिल में हमारे। नाना की मेरी शक्ल है पैकर में तुम्हारे, तुम सूरत महबूब खुदा मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिजा मांग रहे हो। बाबा तुम्हें अम्मा ने भी कुछ दर्स दिया है, आदाबे वफा से मुझे आगाह कीजा है। पहले मैं मरूं आपसे वादा ये किया है, बस इसलिए मरने की रिजा मांग रहे हो, एक बाप के मरने की रिजा मांग रहा हूँ। है आपका बाबा भी और खातून कयामत, और माँ है मेरी अदना सी एक पे करिश्मत। क्या सीने में उसके नहीं कुछ जज्बा इसी मार, मैं मादरे मुस्तर का कहाँ मांग रहा हूँ, एक बाप से मरने की रिजा मांग रहा हूँ। बाबा बाबा, एक बाप से मरने की रिजा मांग रहा हूँ, एक बाप से मरने की रिजा मांग रहा हूँ। अकबर तुम्हें मालूम है क्या मांग रहे हो, तुम बाप से मरने की रिजा मांग रहे हो। खातूने जन्नत फातिमा बिनते मोहम्मद पर बावाज़ बुलंद सलवात, अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मद व आली मुहम्मद व अज्जिल फरजहum.
Thank you very much for those beautiful recitations. We are fortunate today to have Dr. Ali-Reza Bhojani. Ali-Reza is a lecturer at the Al-Mahdi Institute, co-director of the Center for Intra-Muslim Studies, and a research affiliate at the University of Oxford. A graduate of the Al-Mahdi Institute, his research, teaching, and writing focuses on intersections between Islamic legal theory, theology, and ethics. He has a PhD from Durham University, and he has held academic posts at the University of Nottingham, the University of Oxford, and the Markfield Institute of Higher Education. Please can we welcome him with a salawat.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين شفيع ذنوبنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبا القاسم محمد والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم وهو أصدق القائلين وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله ويوم الآخرة وذكر الله كثيرا. The verse of the Quran which I've just recited, I will loosely translate before coming back to it in the course of this talk. In Surah Al-Ahzab, in verse 21, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ Surely there has been for you in the Messenger of Allah a beautiful model, a prime paradigm. لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُ اللَّهِ For the one who hopes of God. وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرَةِ For the one who desires God, longs for the next life. وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا And remembers God, is attentive to God excessively. Over the last few nights, we have been talking about seeking to revive or to highlight, that vision of Islam which is built upon a spiritual ethics, a spiritual morality, where a godly ethic shapes us and drives us, built out of conceptions of God's justice and God's rahmah, seeking a religion which is not simply hanging upon the tongues, but has an impact in our lives, brings value in our life for ourselves and for those around us. Yesterday, we talked about how this type of theological belief, because it's a theological vision which we're setting forth, doesn't have to be dogmatic. It can embrace differences. When we see difference as an opportunity to grow in our appreciation of truth, and when we recognize that there's always more to discover, remembering that our accountability before God and in the afterlife is to the extent that we have appreciated truth, so long as we have not been negligent in the pursuit of that truth, and we try to act in accordance with what we have understood. More generally, over the last few nights, as we set out, on the first night, we've been trying to draw attention to a vision of Islam, a vision of the teachings of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, salawatullahi wassalamu alayhim ajma'in, which is critical, which is rational, and which is deeply ethical and God-centered, that can inform me in the societies, and I say societies, that we live in today. For there is no doubt that these models, Hussain ibn Ali, Muhammad Rasulullah, had dramatic impact on the societies in which they lived. Now, despite the longevity of the impact of the messages of Hussain ibn Ali and everything which is associated with Hussain ibn Ali, his immediate society was made up differently to the immediate society of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu wasallamu alayhi. And in fact, the makeup of the Prophet Muhammad's society, the immediate context at least, varied through the life of the prophetic mission. And in these differences, we can see a very, very important insight. So in the differences in the way the Prophet responded to his different contexts, we can draw out important insights into the question of the role for religion in public life, in social life. And that is going to be the focus of my discussion today. The role of religion in our plural, public, social lives. How we can draw on these resources of a spiritual ethics, a spiritual morality, the example of Hussain, the example of Rasulullah, to speak to our particular contexts today. But before moving in that direction, I thought this was an important opportunity to speak about some methodological points when we seek to draw example from these beautiful models, these divine models, these godly models. For Hussain ibn Ali has said, Fiyi uswatun. It is reported that he said, in me is a model, in me is an example. The Quran describes the Prophet Ibrahim, that father of monotheism and a God-centered approach to belief and life, whose model of God-centricity, by the way, was deeply critical and deeply rational. This father of monotheism is described in the Quran as an uswa, as a model. The Quran in the ayah which I recited at the beginning of this talk describes Muhammad Rasulullah as a model. لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. There is for you in the Messenger of Allah not just a model, a beautiful model. Now, of course, the specific context of that verse, according to the Mufassirin, was in the context of a battle. And it seems that the ayah in its specific instance was addressing the companions and saying, look at the steadfastness of the Prophet. Look at his perseverance in the face of this deep traumatic difficulty. Especially when we hear of the Maghazi literature, actually another side issue. Islam, when we look at works of Islamic history and prophetic life, often these are based around wars. Not because the Prophet was first and foremost a warmonger, but because that's the way history was written. These were major events. And in the storytelling of the Prophet's lives and other giant personalities of that era, which often relayed around wars, we forget that war is traumatic. War is deeply difficult. And in the face of those difficult circumstances, the Prophet was steadfast. His relationship with God, his ethical qualities, which were absolutely consistent, irrespective of those different societal challenges which he faced. The Prophet was telling, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling the companions, in Rasulullah, there is a beautiful model for you. Of course, this verse has much wider import, much wider relevance than in the context of a battle. Because the Prophet of God is seen and described as this ethical, spiritual model par excellence. And that model can speak to the different challenges of our day. When we look to his social impact, his response to real challenges, contestations, difficulties. And although never identical, in concrete terms, those challenges can resonate with our challenges today and inspire spiritual and ethical responses. But the methodological point which I wanted to draw attention to, when we seek to take inspiration, take guidance, take light from those models to illuminate the present, the methodological point I wanted to make is this: that when the Prophet is described in the Quran as a beautiful model, it isn't in an unqualified or absolute sense. The Quran doesn't say that the Prophet was absolutely a beautiful model. This may give us pause for thought. But when we look around us today, we can see that yes, what Muhammad Rasulullah means to us, who have been brought up on a vision of the Prophet, who was known as truthful before he declared his message of God. What Muhammad means to us who have been brought up on a vision of a prophet who was a reconciler of people, who was a carer for orphans, a carer for the vulnerable, a bringer of peace and dignity for humankind. You know, our vision of the Prophet Muhammad is radically different to the Muhammad which is evoked in the minds of those we often live with. If you mention the name Muhammad, the Prophet, to the average Canadian on the streets, that vision isn't associated with Al-Amin and the reconciler and the giver of charity and the raiser of dignity. It's associated with, you know, with terrorism. It's associated with mischaracterizations of Sharia. It's associated with disgusting abuse. Muhammad, as a historical character, is not absolutely a beautiful model. And the Quran, it seems, recognizes this. It's amazing. It says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. It says, surely there is in the messenger of God a beautiful model. لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُ اللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرِ وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. There is a beautiful model. Surely there's a beautiful model in the messenger of God for one who hopes for God, who is fearful of the hereafter, and who mentions God continuously. Look, it seems that the Quran is nodding here towards the need, hinting, directing us to the need for a theological reading of the Prophet's example. Look, I'm not talking about questions of authenticity and historicity. Did this actually happen in the Prophet's life? It's a different question. See, look, even when we know of something from the Prophet, you know, it becomes a beautiful model for us when it is read with consciousness of God, when it is read with a sense of moral accountability, when it is qualified by reason and ethics, and with a consciousness of God. Look, we can't just lift anything that we find attributed to the Prophet like a cut and paste job, okay, and plant it onto contemporary society. No, it seems that the Quran itself recognizes we need to take these stories from the life, from the lessons, as a heuristic model. What do I mean by a heuristic model? It's a guide. Yes, it should direct us. It should inform our understanding of God, our understanding of the world. But in turn, our understanding of God must qualify the way we read these sources, such that they can actually inform us here and now. Now, with that qualification, with that, if you like, ethic of reading into the life of the Prophet and the example of the Prophet within the boundaries of ethics, within the boundaries of reason, in a God-conscious fashion, such that reading of the Prophet can inform my understanding of God, and my understanding of God informs my reading of the Prophet, we turn to think, we turn to seek light towards the challenges of our day. And the particular question which I want to now continue with, and that is the role of Islam and Muslims in public life, in a plural society. Now, when we look, of course, speaking from the United Kingdom, there are many similarities between our context and the context in Canada. In Canada, I understand from recent studies that around 8% of the society in Canada, according to 2011 demographic surveys, 8% of Canadian society is Muslim. That's across the whole nation. So you can imagine in a state like Ontario or in a city like Toronto, that proportion must be higher. Maybe 1 in 10 of Toronto is Muslim. Now, of course, within the Canadian context, there are differences. We know there are differences in terms of public life and the vision for public life at a federal level, and there are differences in Ontario, and there are differences in Quebec, informed by different visions of secularity, informing these two spaces. At a federal level, there is still in Canada, this commitment to a multicultural model, which seeks neutrality towards religion. In Quebec, it's quite different. This being much closer to the European model I'm aware of in France, which seeks to make the public place, the civic space, absolutely neutralized from religion. Very different models that are going on. Okay, we have this tension in Europe with different visions. In Canada, you have it within one country. And of course, this leads to real feelings of discrimination, real senses of challenge, and contested boundaries of where are the limits to discrimination. And the increased polarization which we are experiencing is of course rampant, and often exploited through symbols and different impressions of Muhammad Rasulullah, or different impressions of Sharia. And anti-Muslim sentiment is used so widely for political gain and identity politics, not just by non-Muslims, by the way, by Muslims as well. And the othering of Muslims has reached such an extent that it can motivate acts like you saw in London, Ontario in April, with the killing of an entire family in London. Now, whether we're talking about microaggression against Muslims or any other, intersection of society and subtle prejudices, or these sheer, unadulterated, heinous acts of murder, it reminds us that the stakes in our struggle for a religiosity that goes beyond being simply a marker of identity are so high. How do we find a vision of God and a godly life that goes beyond the tongue and that can navigate this real difficulty outside, that can inform our spiritual and ethical dispositions in the plural public spaces that we find ourselves in? Now, of course, you know your context better than I. What I hope to do in what follows here today, very briefly, and in some of the subsequent nights, is simply point to resources within the life of the Prophet and the inspiration of Hussain ibn Ali, to exploring those examples as a heuristic, as something to help us think through, to reassess, our responses, what they could be, what the directions we could take ourselves and our communities in, to help inform the real, diverse challenges that we face sometimes on a daily basis in our schools, in our workplaces, in our lives. And I want to do that today, thinking about the communities within which we live, by mining the idea of community itself within Islamic discourse. Now, when we think of the notion of community in Islamic discourse, often the first notion which comes to mind is the notion of ummah. And of course, this notion of the ummah of the Muslims, the ummah of Muhammad salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi, has a special place in the minds of the Muslims. And often in the idealized sense, at least in the conception of Muslims, is something which gives us identity. And that identity serves to separate us from others. But I want to challenge that conception of the idealized notion of the ummah within Islamic discourse. So what does ummah mean literally in language, in the Arabic language? Literally in the Arabic language, ummah simply refers to a group of human beings, of people who have some mutual link amongst them, something which they share. Sometimes this is in terms of a language. So we talk about the Arab ummah, or we could talk about the French ummah. Sometimes the link between people is simple language. Sometimes it may be religion. Okay, sometimes it might be an economic link. We talk about this, you know, we talk about the community of, I don't know, the community of traders or the community of philanthropists. Okay, so an ummah could apply to an economic link between peoples where they have some shared aim, some shared belief, some shared political value. Hence, we could talk about the Ummat al-Arabiya or the Ummat al-Islamiyya. Now, what about the Quran? That's a linguistic analysis. Very briefly, just pointing towards. What does it mean in language? Language just means a community which has some link. Could be of different types, of different shapes, and different forms. And in the Quranic sense, again, we have it used in multiple ways, simply describing different groups of people, different communities of people. The word ummah is used in the Quran to refer to the Jews sometimes, to the Christians, to communities who came before, communities who are yet to come. And yes, the Quran uses the word ummah in an idealized sense, which has captured the imagination of the Muslims. One such example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrajat linnas. You are the best of communities, the best of ummahs, which have been brought forth for people. Elsewhere in Surah Al-Baqarah, again, an idealized notion of ummah, which has been, you know, and which has captured the imagination of the Muslim. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. And accordingly, we have placed you as a model ummah, you know, a balanced ummah, an ummah, okay, which is, I think a model ummah is a good translation of wasat. Wasat literally is like the, you know, on a balancing point. Yeah, we have like the old scales. Okay, the wasat is the point in the middle. Okay, which holds things together, by the way. Okay, yeah, so وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا in Surah Al-Baqarah. But in both cases, this idealized ummah, كُنْتَ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ, or the ummatan wasatan, this description of the idealized Muslim ummah is also qualified by purpose. And in both cases, we see the purpose of the idealized Muslim ummah is not to separate us from others. In both cases, the idealized Muslim ummah is to put us at the service of others. Kuntum khayra ummatan, kuntu khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. You are the best of communities who have been brought forth for people, for humankind. The verse of Surah Al-Baqarah, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. We have made you a model ummah or a median ummah or the pivot. لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ. So that you may be a testament to humankind. Look, this notion of the ummah is not to separate us. It's to put us at service of others. You know, this idealized notion of ummah that we see from this Quranic vision is, of course, absolutely demonstrated in the ummah of Rasulullah himself. Salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. His vision, his mission was not restricted to any one type of people. His rahmatun lil alameen. Look at the migration story of the Prophet. You know, when the Prophet was said to have migrated from Medina, or towards Medina, sorry, which at that time, from Mecca to Medina. At that time, before it was known as Medina, it was known as the town of Yathrib. Now, Yathrib was a place which had been plagued by something like 200 years of intertribal war. Okay, bitter blood feuds had ravaged this society for generations. And as part of the deal, if you like, to bring the Prophet, the agreement to bring the Prophet, for him and his followers to be offered refuge, they were refugees, they were asylum seekers. Okay, but part of the deal was that the Prophet would become a reconciler to their disputes. Look, if we think about, now please forgive me if I'm being presumptive, that many of the listeners within this community are maybe first generation, second generation, third generation migrants. Okay, we ask ourselves, what did we bring to the places we migrated to? Canada's Muslims, that 8%, the vast majority of them are economic migrants and increasingly refugees who again have been, have been given sanctuary from persecution, just as the Prophet Muhammad was given sanctuary from persecution. But his immediate question wasn't, what can you give to me? He went to Medina and sought to help contribute to resolving wider society's problems. He was a peace bringer, an arbitrator who allowed for the Muslims as a minority to live amongst the non-Muslim majority, initially made up of Arab mushrikun tribes, Arab tribes who were associated with God, and Jewish tribes, those who didn't accept the truth of the Prophet Muhammad. In a famous pact, once the Prophet Muhammad became established early on in Medina. Okay, it's often described as the constitution of Medina. Yes, it wasn't a constitution as we know it today. Okay, it was a pact, it was an agreement, a mithaq. Okay, this was set up amongst the communities there, amongst these multicultural society of Medina. And it set up mutual rights and responsibilities, means of dispute resolution, allowing for the different communities to continue in their different forms of religious and cultural practices. This multicultural group, multi-religious group, where Muslims were the minority, is described in this pact, as recorded in the Sirah of Ibn Hisham and Ibn Ishaq, as a single ummah. Innahum ummatun wahida. This grouping of Medina, where Muslims were the minority, Jews, mushrikeen, this is one ummah set aside from the rest of broader Arabian Peninsula. Explicitly in the case of the Jewish tribes, Inna Yahudam min Bani Auf, ummatan ma'al mu'mineen. Says, yes, this particular group of Jewish people, they are a ummah with the believers. Look, we see here a form of secularity, okay, separating between religious identity, systems of life, and rules that are agreed upon for the mutual benefit of all. We see communities within communities, not to separate us, but for the mutual benefit of each other. Now, what should be our fundamental role within broader society? Okay, within our ummah of Canada or our ummah of the UK, okay, of England or wherever else we may find ourselves. Look back to that verse which I've cited. Kuntu khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas ta'maruna bil ma'ruf wa tanhauna 'anil munkar wa tu'minuna billah. It says you are the best of communities, brought forth for the sake of humankind, not for the sake of yourselves only. Look, if we elevate ourselves, we've really only elevated ourselves if we actually elevated those around us. Okay, it's kind of like, it goes hand in hand. Real development would mean that my society is developing. So how can I develop myself spiritually? If I do develop myself spiritually, I must be developing myself ethically. And this is about my relationship with others. Look, if the Prophet's message was for personal salvation, in that personal salvation is the radical transformation of societies. The verse of the Quran says, Kuntu khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. You were the best of communities, brought forth for the sake of humankind. Ta'maruna bil ma'ruf wa tanhauna 'anil munkar. Calling to the good and warding off from that which is bad. We're back to those two terms which I spoke about on the first lecture, calling to the ma'ruf and seeking to refrain from the munkar. Remember what I said, that these terms ma'ruf and munkar, look, pivotal to the identity of Muslim communal purpose and never defined in the Quranic context. Literally, as we said on night one, These terms, this term ma'ruf, if we just focus on ma'ruf gives us the sense of common values. Ma'ruf is those things which societies agree upon as being good and worthwhile. Those things which are deemed valuable to society at large. If you like, our common good, our shared aspirations. And we see the Prophet of God when he came to Medina, what did he bring? He brought peace. He brought reconciliation. He uplifted the status of the refugees. He brought tranquility to those who housed them. That persistent messages of Hussain ibn Ali, demonstrate to be one who stood against corruption, against nepotism, against social, economic degradation. These things go across particular communities. Their shared aspirations, their shared values. Hussain ibn Ali describes his very mission as a move towards such values. إِنَّمَا خَرَجْتُ لِطَلَبَ الْإِصْلَاحِ فِي أُمَّةِ جَدِّي. I have come, or I set off, in the famous, widely cited report, I set forth for no other reason, out of Medina, out of Mecca towards Kufa, for no other reason but to seek the betterment, the Islah, of my grandfather's community. Remember, grandfather's community, vision of community was so broad, ours is so narrow. Hussain ibn Ali seek to better the state of his grandfather's community. أريد أن آمر بالمعروف وأنهى عن المنكر. I simply sought to call towards the good. Look, those who fought against him in Karbala, they prayed, they fasted, they declared La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. So what was it that Hussain sought to revive? He sought to revive the universal ethics, which those practices are meant to take us towards. The ethics of working, he sought to revive the ethics of working towards things we agree upon, despite our differences, those things which have universal value. And it is in the universal messages of Rasulullah and Hussain ibn Ali that made their particular messages, their particular way of life, this particular form of submission to God through these practices so appealing. It was reported that on the way to Karbala, Hussain ibn Ali stopped at a place called Tha'labiyah. And Imam Hussain met with a family that was Christian. And he met with Wahab. And the personality of Hussain ibn Ali, his ethics, inspired her so quickly and so radically that his goals became her goals. And her goals were united with his goals. The appeal of Hussain ibn Ali, ultimately, Wahab, introduced Hussain ibn Ali to her son, Wahab, this young man, who according to the reports, was recently married. This recently married man met Hussain ibn Ali, was struck by his magnanimity, his ethics. And soon his newly married wife again also fell for Hussain ibn Ali. These two would be amongst the first martyrs of Karbala. The appeal of Hussain ibn Ali, just like his grandfather, was universal. Their spiritual morality, which they attained, no doubt, through these particular practice, prayers, fasting, zakat, hajj, khums, Muslim community, assisting each other. But these practices, this community was for the sake of humankind more widely, was for the sake of uplifting every other. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bi fina'ik. Alayka minni salamullahi abada ma bakitu wa bakiya al-layl wa an-nahar wa la ja'ala Allahu akhir al-ahdi minni li ziyaratikum. Assalamu ala al-Hussain wa ala Ali ibn al-Hussain wa ala awlad al-Hussain wa ala ashab al-Hussain. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we may be inspired by the examples of the Prophet Hussain ibn Ali to turn towards God, to build in our morality, to be at service to each other and service to the communities in which we live. uplifting ourselves and uplifting those around us. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ahli bayti tayyibin at-tahirin.
Thank you very much for the talk. We will now continue with Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, then please go to menti.com and the code is 25365869. That's 25365869. Please note that the code is available to submit questions in the next few nights, even outside the live lecture. You will be able to listen to all previous lectures on our YouTube channel, and please consider subscribing to be notified of all lectures and programs that we have. So the first question I have is, considering there is a wide variety of linguistic nuances within the Quran, is it even possible to have a total understanding of everything that it has to offer?
So typically a beautiful question. Everything it has to offer, the Quran has so much to offer. As the Quran itself says, if if all the heavens on the earth, so if all of the ink in the seas were pens, the words of Allah would not be exhausted. Okay, so Allah's message is one that can give and give and give and give. And actually, this is the beauty in the Quran, is that it can always give us more. And this is partly why we need a critical approach to our understanding, such that we can, as I was kind of hopefully alluding to yesterday, continually push ourselves to grow in our learning and in our practice. But coming to the issue of the linguistic nuances in the Quran, and I guess it's a very fair question, because I've been drawing within my talks upon particular linguistic nuances to help make certain points. But I really firmly believe that we, and with a holistic reading of the Quran, the Quran unveils itself to each and every one of us. There's a tradition of Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi, which is reported to have said that the Quran is hablullah. This is the rope of God between the heavens and the earth. One side is with God and one side is with each of us. Right? So the Quran can be an integral, it's been described as a rope for each of us. All right. So literacy levels, vary today, and they have varied through history. All right. Okay. The Quran is an opportunity when we approach it with humility. Okay. And holistically, I think holistic reading is very, very important. And that's, if you like, what I was trying to point about the Prophet. So the points I was making about the Prophet's example, that we need to read the Prophet being conscious of God, okay, aspiring towards God, with a rational and ethical framework. It's the same with the Quran, as a whole. So these linguistic nuances can unfold themselves to us. And as a practical tip, because, I've had an opportunity to study Arabic, to work on these things for a number of years, so on and so forth. People think, this is not fair. Okay, where's my access? As a simple tip, if there's a verse which puzzles you, okay, of course, first and foremost, that's a good sign. It's an opportunity to think further and reflect further, right? Okay. Secondly, a small tip would be to compare translations on that particular verse. Through comparing translations, you'll be able to see the different nuances different interpreters have considered, and it can open up a range of possibilities for you.
Thank you.
I think the Quran is deeply accessible, by the way, deeply accessible. Yeah, of course, there's some aspects of it which are inaccessible to the likes of me with my veils, right? But overall, the Quran is deeply accessible. It's something we need to push ourselves to read more, consider more, discuss more.
Leading on for that, we just got another question, which is, if that is so, then why the different interpretations of Quranic ayats by different marja'iyah?
Okay, so first, why the different understandings of the Quran? Because the Quran is not absolutely clear. It's got layers. Okay, if there was no religious ambiguity, all right, okay, then we would all have the same understanding. I think I would sometimes say all, but I'll have to qualify it with most. Yeah, okay, most people agree 2 + 2 = 4, because 2 is clear to us, plus is clear, 2 is clear, equals is clear. Right, so we would accept the answer, right? Okay, as soon as there's ambiguity, it opens up the possibility of differences. right? So the Quran has layers, it has depths, it has ambiguities. Okay, there's certain things in the Quran which are very clear, and there's certain things which are less clear. Yeah, so this affords variety of interpretation. Okay, and in that variety of interpretation is the possibility for us, I'm drawing on points I've made already to try and re-emphasize them, to learn through each other and to grow through each other and recognize that my perspective would always be limited. So I have the opportunity, and I'm missing it this year because I don't get the chance to engage with you more deeply. I have the opportunity to benefit from your perspectives and your insights. Okay, so the Quran is something which is supposed to speak to individuals and communities, and is something which can, as I say, unveil itself through life. So difference in interpretation is not, I think, is part and parcel of the makeup of the way the Quran is designed. Okay, and actually it's the way knowledge works more generally. As for why does this lead to difference in interpretation of the maraja, so I'm going to speak about, I think it's in lecture 6 and 7, Sharia, Fiqh, Ijtihad. All right, and actually ethics of Sharia, Fiqh, and Ijtihad. So I might deflect some of that for that discussion. But we could see it as an implication of even this. If wider society is encouraged to read the Quran, because we are, Quran just for the experts and the scholars. It can't just be accessed through Arabic. It can be accessed through English, as long as it's done with the humility and fallibility that is required as the ethics of learning. So the Quran isn't just addressed to the maraja, but if the general public are going to understand different things, then of course, when it comes to some of the most technical aspects of the Quran, seeking to extract from history and apply to contemporary society, this is going to be open to variation and difference. And so frankly speaking, why do we get differences in interpretation? Because there are different possible interpretations. The Quran is not explicit about the Quran. So if I go back to the framing of this lecture, I said, okay, we want to think about Islam in a plural public sphere. The Quran doesn't give me a direct answer about how to live in a plural public sphere, which is informed by two visions of secularity, a French model and an American model, which is a Canadian situation, right? So the Quran alludes to different issues and deals with concrete challenges and gives us universal moral precepts. We now need to struggle with those things, to seek inspiration from them, to deal with our challenges today. That is going to, by its very nature, lead to diversity in interpretation. Through that diversity, we can check each other's understanding and continuously seek to move to better understandings.
Great. So the next question is, thank you very much for your excellent presentation, very timely and appropriate. Can you please speak on justice and human rights, and whether there is a difference between a Western perspective, such as the UN Charter, and Islamic perspectives?
So this is a huge topic. I appreciate the thanks, by the way. So to think about, actually, when we think about Islam and human rights, a very, very important topic. I hadn't planned to speak about it directly over the course of the next few nights. Very, very briefly, if we're talking about human rights, especially as it's conceived the discourse of human rights has emerged out of a Eurocentric Western discourse, but it's not exclusively a Eurocentric discourse, okay? So in the development of the UN Charter, they engaged with a plurality of voices, and of course, these things have been taken up by a plurality of international voices. And when we think about human rights, we're talking about, or at least, those philosophers behind this stuff are thinking about rights which pertain to us as a human being. So that's irrespective of Islam, irrespective of Christianity, irrespective of secularity. So in that sense, human rights are human rights. Okay? Yeah, and of course, there are extensive resources within Islamic tradition which can support visions of human rights, can help qualify visions of human rights which are being developed, areas of controversy in human rights discourse. But fundamentally, this notion to say that insan, bima huwa insan, is dignified and deserving of respect is something which is enshrined in the Quranic discourse. The Quran says, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا الْبَنِي آدَمَ. Surely we have ennobled the children of Adam. Okay, and of course, the theological vision of the Quran actually goes further. That dignity of insan, bima huwa insan. So insan as insan. okay, actually stems from their divine quality. Because remember, it's the breath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which was breathed into our grandfather. So yes, does Islam have, are there resources within Islam for an absolute commitment to the dignity of human being? Yes. Do Muslims need to revive and embrace those resources? Yes. Are there challenges in terms of understanding certain aspects of Islamic law and Muslim practice with regards to human rights discourse? Yes. So I don't want to just be polemical about it. Yes, there are tensions here, but there are also controversies in human rights discourse. And I think that actually some aspects of Islam's theology, philosophy, ethics can contribute and help clarify some of those contextual questions. So I hope that has helped. I realize it's not comprehensive, but it's a very, very important area of discussion. And some of the regular speakers at OIL are, of course, experts in this area.
Thank you. The final question we have today is, does Allah want everyone to be Muslim in the end?
Very nice question. Very nice question. Okay, in the sense of, we mentioned Ibrahim, salamullahi alayhi. Yeah, my short answer would be, I believe yes. Okay, but what do I mean by that? Yeah, it's not, Allah doesn't need, us standing and bowing and praying and giving 2.5% or 20% or whatever else it is that I need to give actually to make me Muslim, right? But Muslim in the real sense, somebody who is submitted and directed to God, okay? Somebody who is submitting to the truth as it is disclosed towards him or her and acting in accordance with that truth. This is a Muslim, right? This is a Muslim in the realist sense. Or some scholars will talk about M with a Muslim with a lowercase m. All right? Okay, so quoting a verse from the Quran, May yuslim wajhahu ilallah. Okay, whosoever submits his face towards God, okay, or directs his face towards God, becomes God-centered, rendering it more loosely. Okay. Wahuwa muhsinun, whilst being a doer of good, whilst being a source of beauty, فَقَدْ اسْتَمْسَكَ بِالْعُرْوَةِ الْوُثْقَى, then surely they've held onto the firmest of handholds. وَإِلَى اللَّهِ عَاقِبَةُ الْأُمُورِ, because ultimately everything goes back to God. At one level, everything in existence is already Muslim. What Allah wishes is everything is subservient to God. Everything is directed to God. What Allah wishes for us is for us to consciously seek to direct ourselves towards that principle, that ultimate truth. So in that sense, absolutely, Allah wishes from us Islam.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that insightful talk. We look forward to continuing tomorrow. As usual, we would like to end now with the Surah Fatiha for those who are no longer with us. Al-Fatiha.